There are a couple of things that we want to set as a ground rule going forward, ground rules going forward, or guardrails, if you want to call them that, to keep us on the road, so to speak. One thing that we want to talk about, and this will make more of a difference starting next week. Oh no! I'll have to go home if I dump my coffee. I'll take care of that. Can anyone tell me what a fact is? It's not a trick question.
Truth.
Truth. Okay, how do you know something's a fact?
Evidence.
Totally solid or
Prove it. Evidence, laboratory, formulas, all this other stuff. Now, we talked about there were two worldviews. Are there two different sets of facts? In other words, are there creation facts and are there materialist facts? Can they be different?
They can actually be the same, just interpretation.
Okay, I know where you're coming from, but think about it. If a fact is the truth, then a fact is a fact.
Right.
Is a fact is a fact, as they say.
It's interpretation, mostly.
Bingo.
Difference.
It's how it's interpreted. I do that right really small to mess with Al because I know the camera can't pick that up. Facts are facts. Keep that in mind going forward. I know that's, thanks Dave for telling us that. We never would have known. And thank you for, that's the second week in a row I've forgotten to pass out the notes. So thank you for doing that for me. I appreciate that. We need to remember that going forward, that facts are truth. And that truth doesn't change because of our perspective. A lot of people today will argue that because, and I'm going down a bit of a rabbit trail, forgive me for this. A lot of times you'll hear that truth is relative. Now they may be well-intentioned when they say that. What they mean is we have different beliefs. They'll say what's true for you is fine, but it's not necessarily true for me. Well, that's a nonsense statement. Because if it's true, period. Now we can have differing beliefs, and you can believe all kinds of things that are nonsense, but you have every right in the world to believe what you want to believe. But to dispute a fact and call it relative to your perspective is nonsense, because a fact is a fact. Where it comes from is they don't like this word here. They don't like objective truth. And that's kind of a contradiction or a redundancy, I should say. They don't want, objective means that it's the same for everyone. Or at least that's one meaning for it. Like morality. Who are you to tell me how I should think or feel about things? Well, I'm nobody to tell you that. Okay? That doesn't mean that there isn't one. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that I'm not the one to tell you what it is. Okay? Now these things may seem murky right now, but they're going to come into play over the ensuing weeks. There's something else I want to talk about real quick before we go forward. Who can tell me what chance means? And I'm not talking about the good-looking guys name back when you were in high school or anything like that?
Kind of like if you chance, well, I mean, I've got it in my head, but it's not coming out.
Well, it's hard to articulate. I know.
Yeah, it's like, it could be a chance of some,
Could be opportunity.
Opportunity, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I would be glad to let you twist at the end of the rope, trying to get that out, but since we don't, let me help you. You'll hear, and probably have heard many times, that something happened by chance. I just happened by chance to bump into my future husband at the Kmart. I mean, you hear things like that, right? But think about that statement. What does chance mean? Chance is nothing more than a label that we put on mathematical probability, or the odds of something happening randomly. It's just a word like chair or tree or chimpanzee. It's just a label. To say something happens by chance imparts a motive force to it. In other words, it indicates that chance has the power to make something happen. Does it? Heck no, it's a word. It's a label. Nothing can happen by chance. Okay, my grass doesn't get mowed by chance. There's a motive force that has to happen to cause it to get mowed, and that's typically me behind a lawnmower, or on the bigger acres on a tractor. Okay, it doesn't happen by chance. Now, why is this important? Because everything we've talked about up till now, other than the wonderful description of a quantum fluctuation that I read to you, everything has happened by chance, according to materialists. It all happened by chance. Well, we know, because we just talked about it, that in and of itself is a nonsense statement. Nothing can happen by chance. But what they're referring to is mathematical probability. Now, we need to talk about that probability for just a few moments, because it's going to enter into where we're going from here on out to a large extent. And I need something to hold this book down. That's all right. The most common example of probability used in the classroom is the coin toss. Every football game begins with a coin toss. Why does it begin with a coin toss? Well, it's tradition. Well, that's true. But it's because both teams have an equal chance of getting their call. Because there's a 50-50 chance that it's going to be heads or tails. So the probability of that is demonstrated as 50% or 1 and 2, 1/2. Now, what happens? What happens to the probability or the odds if you want to flip heads 2 times in a row? That becomes 1/2 times 1/2, and that gets down to 25%. It drops pretty quickly, doesn't it? It drops pretty daggum quickly. What are the chances of flipping heads 10 times in a row? Well, science, this number becomes so big. This, I don't expect an answer because I've had to do the math, and the number becomes so big that scientists introduced a thing called scientific notation. the numbers are so large that they're unwieldy trying to work them, okay? So they went to this exponent to say, okay, well, this is 10 to the 45th power. That's scientific notation. Well, it may surprise you to find that flipping heads 10 times in a row is 10 to the 7th power. Now, what does that mean? What does this exponent indicate? That indicates the number of zeros following the number. So the odds of flipping heads only 10 times in a row are 1 out of 100 million. Okay? How about 150 times in a row?
That's why I don't work for the lottery.
Yeah. Think about this when you go buy a lottery ticket. To flip heads 150 times in a row is 10 with 45 zeros after it. There's not even a name for a number that big that I know of. You get past, well, you get past hundreds and I'm kind of lost. But think about something when you're talking about terms of the age of the universe, the age of the earth, the age of anything when it comes to science and origins. That looks pretty harmless, doesn't it? Scientific notation, granted, it makes the numbers easier to handle, but to say that you have one chance out of 10 to the 45th, that doesn't look so bad. I mean, does it? Visually? Now, obviously, if you're a mathematician or a physicist, you're going to have some kind of conception, I think, mentally, what that number indicates. But the average person is just going to say, well, that's not so bad. I mean, I've taken a 10% or 20% or less chance on a lot of other things. I mean, if Jeannie were here, she'd tell you she took a fractional chance on marrying me. And 36 years later, we're still here. But that's nowhere near as impressive as writing out the number. And I'm not going to take the time, I'm not going to waste the time to write 10 with 45 zeros after it. But that's the probability of flipping heads for 150 times. The probability of the things we have talked about up till now dwarf flipping heads 150 times. Dwarf it. And we haven't even gotten into life yet. It shrinks it to insignificance. In fact, a man said, and I don't remember where I read this, I stole it from someone else because it made an impression on me. Is Cycle Systems still down in Roanoke? Okay. Y'all ever driven past Cycle Systems down by 581, 220? It's the scrap yard where they recycle all the scrap. A man one time said, imagine, and we'll use it in our hometown because it's something we're familiar with. Imagine a massive explosion occurring at Cycle Systems. And when all the dust settles and the smoke clears, that where Cycle Systems used to be with all that scrap metal, a brand new shiny Boeing 757, fully functional and operational, is sitting there ready to work. Those are the types of probability that we're talking about for any of this to have happened. Now, I mentioned that some years ago in a class, and I had a young man jump up and go, well, it's not impossible. And I have to tell you that
Did he pass your course?
I don't have any words for someone. No, technically, I guess, if you're willing to base your life on those kind of odds, more power to you. But it's as close to impossible as I'm willing to accept. I mean, I'm certainly willing to accept it that way. Now we're going to take a moment, and we will get in your notes because we're going to talk about our dearly beloved Earth. We're going to start. Y'all got this? I mean, you don't need to remember the numbers, but you get the idea of what we're talking about here? Okay. Now we're going to accept the Earth being formed. And I don't mean, there are a lot of books, including my own, that will go into this in more depth if you'd like. I mean, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. The Earth was fully formed, and it's projected or presupposed that it was a molten ball in its initial stage. Well, that's a pretty safe assumption because we know today that the core of the Earth is a molten ball. So that was a pretty safe assumption. Over time, other people say that moons or not stars, but comets and debris crashed in and ultimately formed the Earth. Okay, well, I'm not going to get caught in minutia. Like, I would think that a planet crashing into Earth would have been catastrophic, not helpful in forming the planet, but be that as it may. This is Pangaea. Now, Pangaea, or at least what they suppose was Pangaea, and thank you, Al, for a much better picture than I would have had, or did have. Well, as you can see, it's commonly believed by everyone, regardless of worldview, that all the continents were initially joined together. Okay? Some of you may have noticed that when you look at Earth, the continents do, in fact, and you probably thought this as a kid, since you were a kid, they would fit together as a part of a jigsaw puzzle. And they actually do. Here is Africa. Here's North America, South America, various islands and so forth, Antarctica, Australia. And here's India and Russia and so on and so forth. It's commonly agreed that Pangaea was the original formation of the continents. There's a difference, though, and I promised not to go into the other worldview because we were going to talk about this worldview. But I'm going to mention it a little bit tonight simply because I think it actually more accurate, well, it does more accurately explain what happened. But these continents initially broke up because of volcanic activity and so forth from below the ocean floor that came up and broke the continents apart. And it took about 3 to 4 billion years for... Do you ever, I'll ever do that? Where did I put the remote? Well, it's right here in my hand. To where the continents got the way they are today. Now, we know that the continents move because they're moving now. Depending on the continent, anywhere from 1.5 inches to 6 inches a year. So, at least in theory, if we were all to live long enough, or the Earth was here long enough, all these would circle around the other way and collide again, eventually. Okay? But we know they're moving. And this, by the way, is once it broke up, these are the tectonic plates, which we're going to talk about now. The continents, as it broke up, they moved. And using a map of the world, he noticed a guy named Antonio Snyder in 1859 just happened to notice, just like we did when we were kids, that all the continents seemed to fit together. And that is in your notes. At the time, however, his theory was rejected because there was no known mechanism which would allow the continents to float. or to move across the ocean. Okay? How can a continent float? Well, how can an iron battleship float? You got enough water, you can float near about any daggum thing. Okay? Alfred Wegener was credited for developing the theory of continental drift. The mechanism that Wegener proposed was that it wasn't so much the continents that were moving, but the plates under the continents. They were shifting. Okay? Now, bear something in mind. You've got the molten ball in the center, and every time it gets mad and it wants to spout, it'll shoot some magma up, okay, through a volcano or whatever the case may be. Actually, it's through fissures that form, but it's more fun sometimes to say it gets mad. But when it shoots up, there's displacement that occurs when that happens. Now, the plates actually float on top of that, and the ocean floor is above it. We have a tendency in our heads to think of the ocean floor being the bottom. It's not. It's not the bottom. There is a seabed underneath the ocean floor that moves just like the plates do. Okay? But in any event, the plates move, and as we said, anywhere from 1.5 to 6 inches a year. Now, oddly enough, and I don't know why, but materialist geologists say that Pangaea was here about 400 million years ago. Prior to that, there was another more condensed continent called Rodinia. That was around about 800 million years ago. I'm sorry, Pangaea was about 180 million years ago. But what's a million or 2 years? But before Pangaea, they speculated that there was Rodinia. Now here's the difference. One worldview says that this materialized and it took millions of years for the continents to break apart. The other worldview says, rather than millions of years, the continents may have separated and created what we see today, maybe in a matter of days or weeks. And the reason being, without getting too awfully involved, is, well, let me give you an example. If you take a 1x6, okay, 6 inches wide, only, well, a 1x6 is really 3/4 of an inch wide, but thick. If you take that and you put it right in the center, a guy on either end, and take a 10-foot sheet of drywall and try to lift it, what's going to happen to that drywall? It's going to crack. It's going to break right in half. Okay? I want you to imagine, if you can, and I told you need some imagination in this class, all of this being joined together. Now the earth is still 3/4 water. And there are higher mountains below the water than the Himalayas are above the surface of the earth. That's how deep the oceans are. And this was before all of those mountains formed. Well, it's referred to as catastrophic plate tectonics. But imagine the pressure underneath of here, of the continents, pushing up and making them crack, fracture into the continents that we see today. You would have to have lived through a hurricane or a major water disaster to understand what's going on when this broke apart. Water is going to rush over all of the landmass as it breaks and separates. Water is going to rush and then it's going to recede off. And if you take, maybe you weren't as goofy a kid as I was, but did you ever, in a pool or at the ocean or in a river or lake, try to take an inner tube and hold it under the water? You ever tried doing that?
Yeah, doesn't work.
Well, it doesn't work, but
Shoots out.
if you can get it under there,
It shoots out.
what happens when you let it go?
It'll kill you.
Boom!
Yeah.
And that thing will shoot across the water and it will keep moving until it runs out of energy. Well, we're talking massive amounts of land that are floating, technically. And they break apart and they're submerged under this water. And when that water comes out, those continents are going to shoot across the ocean. Because the ocean isn't separated at this point. It's all, well, everything else, you can only see 2D here, but everything else is water. Now, if we really got into the alternate worldview, which we're not going to do, you put rain and volcanic action and all the rest of this in there, it's even more demonstrative of how this could occur. Okay? But there is a plausible counter theory to millions of years. And actually, if at another time when we get into it, it actually makes more sense. Because it's something that we can see today that happens in different places, albeit on a smaller scale, fortunately. I don't want to be here if that happens again. But that's referred to as catastrophic plate tectonics. Say that fast 5 times. Okay? Now, where do they come up with how they date things? Now again, I told you when we started that I'm going to let sleeping dogs lie and just accept the fact that the earth is here. And I'm just accepting that. We're not going to argue about that because we're going by their worldview, and it is just so. All right? So we get into now the geology and so forth of our planet. And we have all been, I'm sure, either now or when we were younger, impressed by the incredible ages that they say things are. Like, here's a rock that's 500 million years old. How do they know that? Okay, well, here's what they do. Relative ages are assigned to rocks based on the idea that rock layers lower, just common sense, lower in the strata, when you dig a hole, rocks, the further down you go, are going to be older, and the closer to the surface are going to be newer. Common sense, right? Wow. The world doesn't work that way. Determining the relative age of a rock layer is based on the assumption, and remember, we're in church, based on the assumption that you know the ages of the rocks around it. That's a huge assumption. Because if you can't date one rock, how can you date another one? A rock is a rock, as they say. Or as Jeannie will sometimes say, I'm dumb as a rock. But uniformitarian geologists, now remember what, let me back up. Do you remember what we said? We gave some definitions in the first week. We talked about uniformitarianism. Does anyone remember what that is?
What it was back then
Is the same as what we see today. Excellent. That's exactly right. all things, because we can measure data today, the assumption is made that it's always been this way. That too is a huge assumption, and some would even say that it's an irrational assumption. However, that's the assumption that is made. Uniformitarian geologists use so-called absolute dating methods to determine the ages of the surrounding rocks. Notice that word, absolute. That sounds like they're pretty confident in what they come up with. This method enables scientists to determine the actual age of a rock. Really. And by the way, we have a fossil here. I don't want you to get excited because I realize at this time there's no life on Earth. We have to blend it, we have to be flexible here because this is necessary to demonstrate something. But they claim to be able to date rocks to an actual age. The fact of the matter is, well, we'll get certain types of rocks, especially those that form from magma, and what's magma? Lava, right? Contain radioactive isotopes of different elements, and it's possible to measure the ratio of different radioactive isotopes. Don't worry, I'm not going to get you involved in trying to know what an isotope is or how to measure them or anything else. What's important is they do contain radioactive isotopes, and they can be measured. These isotopes are referred to as the parent and the daughter. I don't know why they're picking on girls, but don't blame me. The parent and the daughter. Now, one of these absolute dating methods is radiometric dating. Oops.
Next one.
Here we go. Not important that you know this either. I gave it to you to demonstrate something. I'm going to give you a better demonstration on the board if you can remember. Okay? Anyone ever heard of carbon-14 dating? If you've ever read a science book or an earth science book, it's all over the place. Okay? Where do they get that? Carbon-14 is a common technique or excuse me, or radiometric dating method, but it can only be used in carbon-containing things which were once living. Was a rock ever living?
No.
And negative.
I think so.
It may have something that was living inside of it and the rock fell on it, I don't know, something like that. But rocks were not living. It can only be used to test something that was living. Okay? All radiometric dating is based on the fact that radioactive isotopes decay to form isotopes of different elements. Okay, again, this is a fact. Those isotopes decay, and I'm getting to the point. You're going to see what I'm talking about here in a minute. Those radioactive isotopes decay, and that decay can be measured. Why is measuring so important? Because that's science. Okay? Science tells us that these isotopes decay and they are measurable. The starting or the original isotope is referred to the parent, and the end product of that decay is the daughter. Again, I don't know why they're picking on the girls. I don't know why they would use daughter for things that decay. I'm not going there. But that's what they did. okay? The time it takes for 1/2 of the isotope to decay to the daughter is known as the half-life. Now, if certain things are known, it's possible to calculate the time since the parent started to decay. This is all very important because I'm going to explain it to you with an example now. Let's look. Now this is the only thing I have in my house to tell time with, which would probably explain why I'm late a lot. Let's look at a common hourglass. Some people still use them as egg timers or what have you. An hourglass is a very effective timekeeper. It is, if you know certain things. Not guess, or not almost, but if you know certain things. Same thing with this discussion of radioactive isotopes over here. If you start with 1 gram of carbon-14, okay? Now I'm going to cheat a little bit and give you the math. After 5,730 years, you'd be left with 1/2 gram. Okay? Half of the radioactive life of that carbon-14 that could only be used or measured in something living for the sake of dating purposes. Okay? After 11,460 years, you're only going to have 1/4 gram. Because it's 1/2 and then 1/2 again, right? And then don't get hung up on the math. That's not where we're going. The rate of radioactive decay must be known. Just like the amount of sand in our hourglass must be known for it to tell time, for it to be reliable. Now, I have a question for you. How can we know how much carbon-14 was in something 400 million years ago?
What's in it now, maybe?
You guess.
The law of uniformity says that because it has this much carbon in it today, if we do the math backwards, that's how they come up with it. But the reality is, we don't know. I want you to think in your personal life, and I'm not talking about science, but how many things do you know? I mean, know, would take to the bank. I can think of just a few. The love of my children, the love of my wife, in my particular case, the love of God, the love of my mother, my father. Those are the only things I know about anything for a lead pipe cinch, right? There's no way I would ever make the claim that I knew how much carbon-14 was in something 400 million years ago, okay? But that's one of the requirements for this radiometric dating, known as carbon-14 dating, to be reliable. That's one of the things you have to know. The second thing is that there has been no loss or gain to the parent or daughter isotopes from the rock.
How would you know that?
Because think about it. The rock is sitting here. 400 million years have gone by with water running over it, volcanic action all around it, early forms of life. You know? So we have to also know that this hasn't been contaminated. Can't know that. But that's a requirement for this being accurate. And the last thing, we have to know the amounts of carbon-14 in the parent and the daughter when the rock was formed. Doesn't keep them from using this in science books. Why? Because it's the only plausible or acceptable explanation. Okay? Now, here's something else. What did we say? That's an ugly slide. Let's get it off of there. Ah! That's one of my favorites. I'm going to hide that for a minute. Okay. The problems with assumptions 2 and 3 are obvious. The major problem with assumption 1 is there is no way to prove that the decay rate was not different at some point in the past. Okay? Now, creation scientists have produced evidence of accelerated rates of decay. I'm not going to get into that. Evidence for accelerated decay is found in zircon crystals and so forth. But again, I'm not going to touch on that right now. One of the things we mentioned was that, I'll get on to the next page. Helium, by the way, escapes from the crystals, the zircon crystals, at a known rate, and it's measurable. If those rocks were over 1 billion years old, as materialists claim, the helium would have bled out long ago. Okay. The presence of lots of helium in the crystals is evidence in support of a young Earth, and we'll let it go at that. Now, there's another problem going back to carbon-14. Given our example over here, 11,000, this is 460. Carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,700 years. Okay? Any carbon-14 would have disappeared entirely from the rocks long ago. Long ago. There should be no carbon-14. And diamonds, I'll give you an example, diamonds in particular, they take, say, millions and millions of years to form because of coal being crushed. Well, I can make it, well, I can't, but diamonds, zircons, can be made in a laboratory. But diamonds, they say, take millions and millions of years of coal collapsing to make a diamond. There should never be any carbon in a diamond. There is. Okay? Just so, we will move on to the next phase. Okay? And again, assumption 3 that we were just talking about does not consider the fact that isotopes can be inherited from neighboring rock as magma moves through the crust of the Earth and so forth. And interestingly enough, rocks only a few feet apart can have entirely different ages, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. I'm going to jump a little bit because there is no real logical way to proceed with this. But this is called the geologic column. Now, the geologic column is like a cross-section or a slice of Earth and showing the ages of different periods of time as the Earth developed. Now, you can Google this, and there'll be 1,000 different representations of the geologic column. I like this one because I like the guy throwing the trash over the side. That makes perfect sense to me. But the interesting thing, this is just a representation of these periods and so forth, but doesn't it look very neat and organized and clean? Like, boom, 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 boom. You know, here's 65 million years ago, here's 199 million years ago, and all this stuff went on, and this is what was around at the time, and it all neatly fits. And if you dig in the ground, you're going to find this kind of stuff as you get deeper and deeper. Doesn't work that way. This is actually a cross-section of one particular spot on the globe. The presumption is that you can go to anywhere on the planet and cut a cross-section and it would look just like this. No, it doesn't. They vary enormously. In fact, you can find different rocks and so forth from this age here, from this age here. Some are cracked and diagonal. I mean, this makes it look very neat and very reasonable. And it's presented just like this in textbooks. Maybe not this particular one, but something similar to it. But this is not real. This may be real in Tucson, Arizona, but it's not in Beijing, China. And if this were what actually happened globally, they should all be very, very much the same, no matter where you are on the planet. But they're not. They differ enormously. Before we begin to look at we need to review the difference in the starting assumptions of young Earth geologists and old Earth geologists. Young Earth basically are those who have the worldview that there was a creator of some sort, call him or her what you will. And old Earth geologists are those who talk in terms of billions of years. Okay? And of course, creationists believe in the biblical scenario or something similar to it. Okay? From the uniformitarian perspective, and that's a cloaking word for materialist, the Earth evolved gradually from a molten ball to a water-covered Earth where mountains are constantly eroded and uplifted and rocks are recycled through the Earth's crust and mantle over billions of years. Any global event, such as a flood, are rejected out of hand. Now, interestingly enough, and this isn't in your notes, I read a book, I don't know who wrote it, not too long ago. I think it came out sometime in the late 90s, and it was called Noah's Flood. And this was a man, I am sure, who had the best of intentions, who wanted to talk about how people could have been deluded into thinking a worldwide catastrophe occurred because of what actually happened where they lived. Okay? And I'm not very good at this. I don't know. We'll want to see if that other map shows it. We weren't anticipating this out. Okay. The Mediterranean. There are geologists that believe that they have proof that there was a massive flood that covered the Mediterranean. The Straits of Gibraltar, or the Pillar of Hercules as they were once known, was closed. There was more land mass here across the straits. The Suez was closed off, the Red Sea, and a massive, massive mini-sea set up over here. And then it breached, probably here, at the Straits of Gibraltar, and the flood receded and left that and exposed it all. his view is that that was carried forward in mythology as Noah's flood. But the point is that they accept the fact that smaller regional floods could have occurred. It's the concept of a global flood that they reject. Okay? Textbook representations of the column depict a composite view of many smaller sections that can be observed. That's what we were looking at here. It's a composite, okay? Now, catastrophism is the doctrine that changes in the geologic record are a result of physical processes operating at rates that are dramatically higher than what we observe, like our example of the Mediterranean. And like I said, they concede that that type of thing has happened. Now, uniformitarianism, the doctrine that present-day processes, again, and you all know this, processes acting at rates, similar rates today as observed, account for the change evident in the geologic record. Now, something interesting comes from all this, and that is why we had our little fish here. He's a handsome fella, and he is obviously dead, and he's a fossil. Maybe you've seen other fossils if you've been to a museum. Actually, every now and then, you can pick one up out in the field. If you're a farmer and you turn rocks over, every now and then you'll find one. They're not uncommon at all, and we'll get into that more starting next week. But it's not actually, even though we've talked about it for half an hour, it's not actually the rocks the geologists are dating at all. Because what's one of the components we said had to be existing in order for it to be dated? Life. Carbon-14 had to have carbon in it. Well, Ralph here, at one time, had plenty of carbon in him. Not so much anymore, I suspect. But here's what they do. And I have to be fair, even materialist geologists, many of them don't agree with this method of dating, but it's used nonetheless. They have come up with index fossils. Now, what are index fossils? Well, let's say we found Fred about 40 feet down during whatever period of time that would have been. Let's say 40 feet down is 10 million years ago. And that's where we dug up Fred. So he's our index, he's our benchmark. He's our barometer for what we should expect to find anywhere else on the planet. Maybe not Fred himself, but kinfolk. Fish that were much like him, or that type of life form, okay? Now if we go to Tucson and dig 40 feet down and we find Fred, the theory goes that if we go to Lansing, Michigan, if anyone would want to, and dig 40 feet down, we're going to find a cousin of Fred's at that level. And that's how they date. Because they can date Fred based on the carbon that's in him. Now, their math is fuzzy because we've already demonstrated that in all likelihood, if he was 60 million years old, the carbon would have bled out of him long ago. But just so, they come up with 10 million years, then they're going to expect to use that fossil to date that layer anywhere on the planet. Does that make sense? Well, I know it doesn't make sense. But you follow me? And they have all kinds of fossils from different layers, different time periods and so forth that they have been able to date by carbon-14. And by the way, there are other radiometric dating types. Carbon-14 is not the only one. But by other methods, they have been able to date the fossil to their satisfaction. So they go with their suitcase of index fossils around the world, dig and match the fossils. So the rocks are not dated at all. It's the fossils that were. So when they look at you and tell you, well, I've got this hunk of granite here that's 600 million years old, how do you know that? Well, my fossil told me so. That's where it really comes from. And I'm not poo-pooing that. I mean, but it's the fossil that they are using to date the rock, not the other way around. Okay? The bottom line is that regardless of your worldview, you don't know what you say you know, based on what we've discussed so far. You are able to present it as fact because you are on the side of science. And what is science? It's testifiable, it's testable, verifiable, falsifiable, observable. Has any of this ever been observed by anyone?
No,
No.
nobody was around.
But it has the label of science on it nonetheless. Let's talk about fossils a little bit, even though they're not living yet, based on where we are in our discussion. Everybody knows fossils are fickle. Bones will sing any song you want to hear. Now, I'm going to give you, and it's not because I'm casting aspersions, but let me give you an example. Some years ago, when I was a boy and going to school, there was a big fuss. All the textbooks were full of two things. And I believe the other one, I should remember this. I always remember it when I'm not teaching it. That's scary, isn't it? Piltdown Man. The amazing missing link that joined us to the monkey. Okay? Nothing has ever been searched for more, I think, other than gold maybe, or uranium, whatever the current metal is, has been searched for more than a fossil that demonstrates a link of some type between modern man and chimpanzee or some sort of original man. Piltdown Man was much lauded in textbooks for a long time. And the interesting thing is, if I remember correctly, they had a piece of jawbone about that big. And from that piece of jawbone, they were able to recreate an entire skeleton. And everyone was very impressed. It was very impressive. Unfortunately, it turned out, I believe it was Piltdown Man, that little piece of jawbone turned out to be from a pig. 30 years later, it was still appearing in textbooks.
Do you remember the picture that showed man evolving from a tadpole to a this to a
We're
this?
gonna get there.
Same thing,
We're gonna get there.
same thing.
That's coming next week. Yes.
It's in our textbooks.
Another one was Nebraska Man. Now, I may have these confused, but again, it was a missing link, and it was determined to be a hoax. There was a fossil of a dinosaur that had feathers. Come to find out, and I'll tell you how this can be done in a few minutes. Come to find out the fossil was man-made, and some man put the feathers on the fossil to make it look that way. it's imperative. Now they're fanatics, look, they're fanatics with a creator worldview that hate and despise anything that disagrees with their worldview. And they are the same on the materialist side. They will do anything, say anything to promote their worldview. I think that's sad regardless, because what we should be looking for is what's true. Okay, regardless of where it leads us. Be that as it may, I'll get off my soapbox and continue on. What is a fossil? A fossil represents remains of once living organisms, like our friend Fred here. Fred, once upon a time, was swimming the ocean blue and frolicking and having the time of his life. Not anymore. Let's leave that alone. Get back to that in a second.
We've been there.
Vernal, Utah.
Yeah.
And it is very difficult in any representations like this, but thank you, Al, for coming up with the two that you did. It's very difficult to see the mass right here, but what this is the Dinosaur National Monument in Vernal, Utah, commonly known as the Wall. Okay? The Park Service, courtesy of our government, will tell you as you take the tour, and tell me if I'm wrong, that this wall of fossils came about because approximately 150 million years ago, there was a drought. And all the animals that had come to this water hole or whatever it was, because of the drought, died. And ultimately, when the drought ended, the waters covered them, and over 150 million years, they became fossils. That's basically what they tell you. Okay? After the drought, the river filled again and slowly covered the carcasses with sand and gravel, and the fossilization process began. This explanation is a wonderful story. Very entertaining, and I'm sure the tourists appreciate the information provided by the United States Park Service.
The fossils are amazing.
However, yeah, and truly they are.
They truly are.
However, fossils aren't made that way. Fossils don't take 100 million years to make. Fossils don't take 1 billion years to make. Organisms must be buried quickly in an environment that lacks oxygen to be fossilized. Let me tell you why. You all may not be from Southwest Virginia, but you live here now, so I know you're as familiar as I am with roadkill. Or maybe, and I'm sorry if I'm scratching a scab, but maybe you've had a pet or an animal that has died out in the pasture. Not an hour goes by when that animal is hitting the road. What happens?
Predators come.
Predators come. You give it a little bit of, and I'm a firm believer that the state bird, at least for our part of the state, should be the turkey buzzard. Because I see, when something's dead, I see a ton more of them than I do cardinals. They are everywhere. I've seen it, I'm sure you have too, I've seen as many as 40 of them out in the field. Everywhere. First of all, you have predators. After that, within a very short period of time, particularly in the summer, and one would think if this were a drought period, it was hot, one would think. Not only do you have predators, but then bacteria and decay set in. And I can tell you that you probably have experienced this as well. You can be driving down the road and not even see the critter that's been killed. You know something's dead. Because you can smell it. My point is, in a very, very short period of time, any trace of that animal will be gone. Period. And I'm sure that if you had a whole cluster of meat laying on the ground, easy to dispose of, you'd have had some predators that were still living that munched down on this. Let me tell you how you can make a fossil. Go to Lowe's, get yourself one of their or Home Depot or wherever you want to go. Get yourself one of those 5-gallon plastic buckets. Get a bag of concrete mix. Okay? Mix it up in your wheelbarrow, get it nice and wet. Pour half the bucket full of concrete. Then, when your kids or grandchildren are not watching, go to the aquarium and scoop out one of their goldfish and lay it in that bucket and pour the rest of the concrete in there. You give it about a week, you cut that bucket off and crack that concrete in half, and I guarantee that fish is fossilized. And that's in a week, not 100 million years. And next time I go fishing, if I catch anything, and if you all promise not to tell anybody, I'm going to make one, just to show you. My reason for pointing that out is, once again, it's presented as just so. It only makes sense that it would take that long because, geez, dinosaurs have got to be 100 million years old. They got to be. Why? I don't know what was going on 200 years ago. I wouldn't know anything about what went on 5,000 years ago, and neither would anyone else. Is it plausible that people believe this? Yes. Because their minds tell them that they want this to be true. The same way that people believe in a creator. Because their presuppositions, their mind tells them that they want it to be true. So regardless, and it may sound like blasphemy or sacrilege to some of you, but it takes faith to believe either one. And there are people who have had the faith for this worldview that, quite frankly, the church burned at the stake for having that worldview. And if Rob lets me do my History of Christianity course, we'll talk about that. But there have been just as unaccepting people in this worldview as there are many of us complain about what we see in our country today presented by people with this worldview. Both worldviews have been just as mean to each other. One's no more innocent than the other, at least through history, is what I'm trying to say.